Tape Deck Media.
Good morning, Ruddle Maniacs and Ruddaholics. Happy Monday to you. We are back for another episode of Rambling with Ruddle. I am, as always, your host, the Turtle School dropout, Taylor Ruddle. So I am back from my Fringe run, well, the first half of the Fringe run, hopefully. I did the Nelson Fringe 2 weeks ago, and then I did the Dunedin Fringe last week at the time of this recording. How did the shows go, you ask? Well, they were interesting. So Nelson Fringe I felt like went pretty well, but Dunedin Fringe I feel like I really dropped the ball and struggled to sell out even half of the tickets that I had available. So I think I need to go back to the drawing board for next year's Dunedin Fringe. And as always, I could always sell more tickets in Nelson, but the Nelson shows were lovely. About half of the shows, I think, in the Dunedin Fringe went really well, and then the other two were a bit rougher. So it was a very humbling, Fringe season for me, I think. I went into it full of confidence, thinking like, oh yeah, I did the Nelson Fringe last year, got nominated for Best Comedian. I did the tour with David there. Like, I'll have no trouble selling out the Nelson Fringe. I had a great name for the show. I had a great poster. And it wasn't exactly the case. Did not do as well as I thought I was going to do. However, the show is actually I'm really happy with the actual show. I sort of went into the Nelson Fringe night one with a collection of like bits and stories and a vague kind of through line. And over the course of those couple of nights, I was like, okay, sweet, we got a show, we got a good format. And then the other 4 shows I did in the Dunedin Fringe, they basically solidified that. So I thought, great. So that show I'm very happy with the actual show. I just need to figure out a better way to get people to actually come and see the show. So that's all well and good. First 2 Fringes down. It's my first kind of proper quote-unquote Fringe season. I'm hoping to do the Auckland Fringe later on in the year, and then potentially the Whangarei Fringe if I can sort of make all of that work. So if you're a listener up north, keep an eye out for those, because I am heading your way, hopefully, if everything pans out. I think it's like September and November those 2 Fringes are on, so keep an eye on my social media to figure out when that's happening. So I don't want you to think that it's all doom and gloom. I just, I suppose I was, like I said, I'm humbled a little bit. I went into it very high in confidence and then had a bit of a reality check after the first couple of nights. But the one thing that really did make it all kind of worth it was I met a few listeners of the podcast at the various shows. So if you're listening still, you haven't been chased off by actually meeting me in person. I just want to say I appreciate you tuning in every Monday, and getting to chat to you after the show definitely keeps me. It just feels like it reinforces that like there are people out there that are interested in what I'm producing. So thank you again for coming out, and I hope you'll keep listening. It really does mean the world to me. So enough of the sap. That's all the Fringe talk. That's all the inside baseball talk for the episode. Let's get on to the topic at hand. So this is going to be a solo episode. This is going to be a Ramblin' with Ruddle. So let's play the intro music for that right now.
All right, Ramblers, let's get rambling.
Okay, so what are we talking about today, Taylor? I'm glad you asked, listener. We are going to be talking about my nostalgia for anime in the 90s. Now, this is actually quite a spooky coincidence of all things. I've been planning on doing this episode since before I went away for Fringe. It's been in my calendar for weeks now. And I suppose you probably know, if you're a fan of mine, then you're probably aware of the passing away of Akira Toriyama a couple of weeks ago, which is incredibly sad. I really cannot put into words how meaningful the whole DragonBall franchise was to me growing up, and even still to this day. If you've seen my act, you'll know that I literally still reference a character Piccolo in one of the jokes. So in a weird way, it kind of lines up for me to talk about the nostalgia I have for the 90s anime, and I've tried to explain this to people that are a little bit younger than me, what the whole 90s experience of kind of like discovering anime was like before we had the internet and Netflix and everything like that. So I think what I'll probably do is I'll talk a little bit about how I became interested in anime as a child, and then at a certain point through that, I'll talk about how meaningful Dragon Ball was to me. and then perhaps talk about some of the stuff I've watched a little bit later in life. I guess you could say I'm a little bit of a lapsed anime fan. Like, I still enjoy it, but now that I'm an adult with responsibilities and other things that need doing, I find it hard to sit through a lot of anime because of a lot of the things they do to pad out the episodes, like the long reaction shots and a lot of faff with the side characters and stuff like that. That tends to lose me a little bit nowadays. That being said, though, I think this could be a little bit of a symptom of the sort of binge watching culture that we have now. Back when you were a little kid watching Dragon Ball Z, like one single episode every day after school, a lot, it didn't really, all this wasted time didn't really add up like it does when you try to binge several episodes at once. If you've been following my career for a long time, then you'll know that I actually started out my stand-up career over in Japan. So this whole kind of story of getting into anime for the first time as a child can sort of be considered a little bit of a backstory to my backstory. I did actually record an episode of the podcast, another solo podcast, just before I went away for Fringe, and it was I'm calling them break glass podcasts. They're ones that I recorded in advance. I've got a couple of them sort of waiting to go. In the case of a guest cancelling, or if I can't release an episode, that kind of thing. And one of them is my origin story of starting stand-up over in Japan. So if you're interested in that, maybe let me know some way. Send me a DM on Facebook or Instagram. And if you're interested in hearing that, if enough people are interested, I might just release that kind of as normal. It's something I've never really talked about at length on a podcast. I've mentioned it in passing, but in that one, I give like a full kind of account of how I moved over there and how I got into stand-up and everything like that. But that's a story for another day. So I'd like to take you back to my childhood. Born in 1992, which means I remember life before the internet. I still remember the days when instead of having your own personal devices, you would still have the family computer. And my first exposure to any kind of anime that I can remember anyways would be to the Pokemon anime. And so I've never been a morning person. I still remember as a child, my mother would get me up for school, I guess maybe 7 o'clock, 7:30, I'm not quite sure. And we had these two blankets at the house. They were my brother and I used to refer to them as the tiger blankets, but they weren't really tiger pattern. They were brown and cream coloured, and they were quite warm and fluffy. And generally we would sleep with them over our duvet, because it got a bit colder in the winter here in New Zealand. And so my morning routine would be my mum would wake me up for school, and then I would kind of wrap myself in this tiger blanket and then shuffle down the hallway, barely with my eyes open. I would plonk myself down in front of the fire, and then we'd flick on the television to watch whatever was on. And this is a very Kiwi-centric thing, but back in these days, we sort of almost didn't really know what anime was. They were all sort of just cartoons that would get played on the television. And Pokemon was the first one that I remember watching, although I know I had been sort of vaguely aware of Sailor Moon at the time. That was another one that they used to play in the mornings, but they always used to play Sailor Moon on Saturday mornings on it was one of those kids variety shows called something like Fox TV. I can't remember. It was an Australian one that we used to get here, but they used to play at 7 in the morning, and who the hell's getting up at 7 on the weekends? And I can still vividly remember the first day my mother put on Pokemon, because I just remember asking her what's on the TV today, and she was looking in the TV guide. God, this is going to sound so old-fashioned. The TV guide magazine. And I still remember the exact intonation she said it. She went, there's this thing called Pokemon on. We're like, oh yeah, we'll give that a bash. So we turned it to whatever channel it was playing on, 2 or 3 or something. And within the first 10 seconds of the show, I was already hooked. Because if you remember the first episode of Pokemon, it turns the screen of the Game Boy game when, what are the Pokemon? Gengar and Nidorino are fighting. It turns that into the animation style of the anime, and it shows them fighting each other. And then I think the main character wakes up from his dream, and he realizes he's late to go and get his first Pokemon, and it explains what Pokemon are, and it shows the 3 starter Pokemon, and just within this few first seconds of seeing it, I was immediately, I was hooked, man. Because this is the reason that as a child, I never really got into cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Popeye and the other one, the Flintstones. Like, the ironic thing is, a lot of these comedy cartoons that were like a very dense with jokes and sort of more like comedy focused was the stuff that I didn't get as a child. Like, I remember I just wanted stuff with fighting in it. That was all I wanted. So as you can imagine, Pokemon scratched that itch like immediately because it's all just fighting. It's animals fighting each other with magical powers. Like, my little 5-year-old brain was hooked. And I still remember a bunch of us would, like, as soon as we get to school in the morning, we would like do a debrief. It'd be like those podcasts that you know, like after Sons of Anarchy or whatever has aired, The Talking Dead or whatever. We would do like a debrief like that of Pokemon. And because we didn't have the internet at the time or magazine, you could find information about it in certain magazines. But for the most part, we learnt about everything from the television show. So we didn't even know how many Pokemon there were. And so, like, if there was a new episode, a new Pokemon that showed up in the episode, we would all be like discussing it, like, what is that? And yeah, like, it was great. I look very fondly back on those days. I do feel so bad for my parents because when you're a child, you don't really understand money and stuff like that. So I'm sure my parents had to get just inundated with requests for Pokemon toys, and we have a collection of these little sort of like, I don't know, they're like inch and a half tall collectible figurines, and we've got a chest of them somewhere, a little toy chest. I'll have to see if I can find those somewhere. I imagine they're probably at my parents' house, but God, yeah. I cannot imagine how much money my parents pissed away on this stuff. So, Mum and Dad, if you're listening, I do apologize. I didn't know any better. I can tell this story here, actually. This might be a slightly amusing anecdote, but you could buy the Pokemon figurines in packs of 2 and packs of 3. And, like, obviously the packs of 3 were more expensive. And my brother and I were set to do, well, no, I don't remember the exact thing, but I believe there's a brand in New Zealand called Weet-Bix, which are like it's our breakfast cereal. It's like how do you explain Weet-Bix? They're like bricks of shredded wheat that have been reformed. I'm sure wherever you're listening in the world, you've got similar cereal. And there was like Weet-Bix had this whole marketing campaign where like, oh, Kiwi kids are Weet-Bix kids, and you're a good old Kiwi kid if you eat your Weet-Bix, and then you go down to your rugby club and you play your club rugby, and like, you know, never that shit never appealed to me as a child. I've never been an athlete. And I remember we used to really resent the idea, like, what do you mean I'm not a Kiwi kid if I don't play rugby and eat wheat? Like, it just, it's, I don't know. Yeah, different times. And, but for whatever reason, they were going to film a commercial for this with students at my school, which I don't know why they would, because we were just in rural New Zealand, and my parents were trying to get us to understand how much money they would get if we did the commercial. And my mother broke it down for me, and like, well, if you do the commercial, you'll be able to buy, like, let's say 5 of the 2 packs of Pokemon and 3 packs of the 3 packs of Pokemon. Like, she literally broke it down in terms that I could understand, with how much money we would get if we did this commercial. And I don't think we did it in the end. I know one of my good friends, Mikey, did it. So I might have to dig that up and see if I can find it again. But we didn't for whatever reason. Maybe I decided the exchange rate wasn't worth it or something. But for whatever reason, we didn't do it. And but yeah, I thought it was a funny little story about my parents understanding my mania for Pokemon. So that was how we discovered shows back then. There would be these children's variety shows. Like, I remember watching one called Sticky TV, I think it was called, which I don't know how to explain this to people if you've never heard of the show. Like, I'm sure other countries have them, but our particular one was, there's usually 2 hosts. Usually it was a man and a woman, and they'd have maybe like a couple of other reporters and stuff like that. And they would do like sketches and stuff, and they would talk to each other and like present the show, but then every half hour or whatever, they would play a cartoon or an anime. It was usually anime. And I remember Sticky TV's one was for, like, I guess this is how well they know children, but they literally used to do a thing called the poo quiz, where the people would go in and they would they would answer questions, and if they got it wrong or something, they would just dump like a hope to God it wasn't real poo, but they would just dump this brown slime thing on top of them. And like the way the presenters would react to it is they would be like, oh, geez, what have you been eating? Like they would imply that it was literally just from like the toilet in the studio. So, oh, the 90s was a wild time, man. There's things you could get away with on the television there. And I remember Sticky TV was on Television 3, which I watched for a bit. But then Television 2, TV2, they added like a competing show called Studio 2, which had the two hosts, Matt and Dana. And Matt, as far as I know, he's still a TV personality to this day. I'm struggling to remember his last name, but I'm pretty sure he was also the host of another Saturday morning show called Squirt, which was him, this Matt character, and then there was a 3D penguin was like his co-host, and I think the penguin was called Spike. Was the penguin Squirt? No, I think the penguin was called Spike. And they also used to do the same thing. They'd do skits in the studio. They'd talk to each other. They'd do contests. You could ring in and stuff like that. And then they would play. It was more typical cartoons. It was stuff like, I remember the Men in Black cartoon was a big one for ages. They would play The Mask, that green thing. You know what I'm talking about. I remember for years, Jackie Chan Adventures was on Saturday mornings on that, which was a tremendous show. I've still got some of the talismans from in my house somewhere from back in those days. I remember they played another show. It was called something like Rusty and the Big Guy. And it was a big robot that had a human piloting it, I think. But it had to pretend that it was just a big robot. I can't remember. There was some gimmick with it and like Rusty was like an Astro Boy. It's like a little boy robot. And the big guy was like a big sort of mecha, like Gundam kind of thing. But anyway, I'm getting a little off topic. Studio 2 was a little bit like that. One of those, they would do sketches, and I quite liked Studio 2 because Matt and Dana had quite a cool sort of chemistry together. And they used to play really good anime. Like I remember they played one of the Mega Man series for a while, Mega Man NT Warrior. I feel like they used to play Digimon as well on Studio 2. I can't really remember what some of the other ones were, but so this was the way things worked in New Zealand, is like you could really only watch the anime like kind of as it was airing on these like sketch show, these sort of like studio shows. But then what would happen is you would get really invested and you would watch, like, let's use Mega Man for example. We watched Mega Man for 6 months or something. And then the announcers would just be like, oh, we're sorry, but we've run out of Mega Man episodes. We don't have any more Mega Man episodes. So then they would either like restart it from the beginning or they would change it to a new anime. And I remember I would be real resistant to change. Whenever they would change it over as a child, I'd be like, no, I'm not going to, bring back Mega Man. Yeah, I'd be like, sort of refuse to watch it. But then, you know, what else am I going to do? Like, that was my thing I would do after school, was just watch TV. So, you know, you watch a couple episodes and then you get invested in it and then you forget all about the other one and you're just following this new one now. Even just talking about it now, I've just remembered one that I need to go and look up again. It was called Flint the Time Detective, and it was one of these after school ones. I can't remember if it was connected to one of these shows or if they just played it, but I need to remember. It was the weirdest story. It was like the main character was this little caveman, and I think he was Flint, and then his father had been imprisoned in a rock, like a hammer. It was his weapon, and he used to refer to it as his father. And then I think there were two other characters. There were two like regular characters that would have some kind of time machine, whatever you call it, time travel ability. And the show would just be them time traveling to different areas, and like I forget what they were called, but they were little monsters or something, and they all had special powers, and that they were trying to capture them and then send them back to their home, or they were trying to do something with them. I think that's a pretty common formula for a show. Like I remember the Lilo and Stitch show was kind of similar. I wouldn't really consider them anime, but yeah, they did the whole thing of like each episode is a different cousin, and the cousins all have different powers, and there's some baddies trying to capture the cousins, and so they're trying to find the cousins their home or their rightful place. I forget, they had some kind of thing for that. So that was a hell of a tangent, but the point is this is if you weren't a fan of anime back then, this is the only place you could really find it, would just be through these kind of variety shows or early in the mornings. I think they also did play some after school, and I guess at some point Pokemon must have moved to after school, because I remember maybe once they realized how popular it was, they moved it to after school, because I remember the TV lineup of me getting home. It was like, I think Dragon Ball Z must have been on at 3:30, and then Pokemon was on at 4 o'clock. It was, I'm struggling to remember what the order was, because I remember I would always just catch the tail end of Dragon Ball Z. So I think Dragon Ball Z must have been on first, and then Pokemon after that, and then after Pokemon, I think it would always be like a normal cartoon. It'd be like SpongeBob or Hey Arnold, or so. It would be like a conventional cartoon. I suppose just quickly as another little interlude, like there's a thing called Sky TV here in New Zealand, which I think is kind of the equivalent of having like satellite in the States, or cable. I think probably satellite, because it was done through a satellite. But there was a whole channel that was called Cartoon Network, and thinking about that now, I almost look at that like, man, that was so cool to be able to just switch it to Cartoon Network, and then at any point throughout the day there were going to be some cartoons playing. I feel like with the age of streaming, sometimes I want to watch something, but I don't really. It sounds ridiculous. It's more effort than I want to go through to like select something. I don't want to have to deliberately select something. I kind of miss the days of channel surfing. So to be able to just click it on, switch to like 42 or whatever the channel was for Cartoon Network, and then you just know like, oh, there's going to be some kind of cool cartoons playing. That I kind of miss those days. We'll come back to Cartoon Network because they had a segment called Toonami, which becomes a massive part of my life. But so that's the kind of landscape of how you watch anime back then. Computers, I wasn't old enough to really know if you could get anime online at this point, and I was sort of too young to really know how to do it at that age. I'll just sort of quickly go through some of the other morning ones that I used to watch, because I know Pokemon was not on in the mornings. I think probably after they realized how popular it was, they moved it to the afternoons. But some of the other ones you used to watch in the mornings, I just sort of have these hazy memories of. But Zoids was a cool one. It was like this anime about these big fighting robots that people could like pilot. I remember Zoids being on in the morning for ages, which was quite a cool story to follow, because it was. Let me think about this for a second. The Zoids was. It was like, I'm tripping over myself a little bit here. To get my thoughts in order. So like, because we were getting anime so much later than the States and Japan, obviously, the way they used to air things over here was so confusing at times. Like, we got a series called Zoids, which I think had the subtitle of New Century, but this was actually like the third series of Zoids over in Japan and the States, I guess. So then once that run had finished, they played Zoids. I can't even remember what it was called, but it was like the prequel series. I think it was called Chaotic Century or something, and it had like a way different vibe to the first series. And because the first one that we saw, New Century, was like like the main characters were in this organized team, and they would have like basically like boxing matches. You know, there'd be like a referee, and they'd have these like 3-on-3 Zoid battles. It was all very organized, and like there was a system in place. And then Chaotic Century was like almost this like Western where there was no laws about fighting Zoids. You basically, it'd be like having guns. You would like rob people using your Zoids, and you are fighting to defend your life from like people riding Zoids. And I think there was even wild Zoids back in that show. It was mad. Another one we watched for ages in the morning was Beyblade. I still maintain that like the dub of that has some of the best music out of any like English adaptation of an anime. And the mad thing is Beyblade is like still going to this day. I still see Beyblades in the warehouse and Kmart and stuff when walking around looking at the toy aisle. Don't worry about why I'm in the toy aisle. I'm buying stuff for my cousin. Yeah, buying it for my cousin. There was another one in the mornings that I was like hooked on for ages called Metabots, which was like these little fighting robots that were like maybe 3 feet tall. And the way they would, like when you beat the other robot, you get to take a piece of their robot. So they were all divided up into like head and torso, both arms and then legs. So you could take like the legs of your opponent and then equip that on your on your robot. I remember we got really into that one. Again, I'm also just now realizing so many of these shows were basically just commercials for toys, which people like my poor parents were basically forced to buy for their like, because Beyblade, we had Beyblades as a kid. There was always a thing at school where we would at each term, at the start of each term, all the previous bans would get like sort of lifted, and it would be countdown until they get banned again. And Beyblades was always like banned really quickly because people would start to gamble. They'd like bet, like if I beat you, I can have your attack ring and whatever. And that, I guess that's considered gambling. So they had to nip that in the bud before it got out of hand, because you'd always have people would lose, and then like your parents, I didn't understand it at the time, but now I totally get it. If your parents bought you this $50 Beyblade and then you come home from school with like, oh, I lost it, I lost it in a match with like some other kid, the first thing you're gonna do is call the school and be like, nah, my kid's not gambling away this stuff I paid like probably a lot of money for. It was of course the same with like Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Yu-Gi-Oh cards would get banned within like a couple of weeks because people would do trades and then like realize they got ripped off, and again, the parents which paid for that. I totally get it now. I didn't understand it as a child, but it makes complete sense now. It's like, yes, it does belong to the child, but the child did not pay for it. All right, so let's get into Dragon Ball, and cause this is probably going to be probably the most of the rest of the podcast. I could probably do another one about Naruto, but man, I've got such a bitter taste in my mouth for the end of Naruto. I feel like Naruto started off amazing, but by the end, I remember reading the manga as it was coming out and just being like, can this please just end already? I'm so ready for this show to be over. And then fucking when it was, the fucking author were like, great, now he can retire and he can do something else. And then he was like, oh, actually, I'm going to start a new series about the main character's son, but all the characters are just basically the same characters as back in the first Naruto. And just, I hate Boruto so much. I hate the sequel series to Naruto. He should have just let it be. Like by the end of it, don't get me wrong, I feel like if Naruto had ended around the arc where he was where they were fighting the what is he called? The Pain, that's what the guy's called, Pain, the orange guy. If that had been the last fight and like everything had wrapped up because of that, it would have been like one of the greatest animes of all time. But man, because it just kept going and they added all this weird shit with aliens and stuff into it, it was no. So yeah, Naruto was a big part of my life, but I just feel so not jaded, but I don't know. I guess this is like how real Game of Thrones fans felt when the last two series came out. Like I didn't mind it. I know there was some stupid shit in it, but Game of Thrones was never like that precious to me, I guess, whereas Naruto was. So I feel very shortchanged by the weird ending of Naruto. Alrighty, well, we are finally up to the part of the podcast where I'm going to talk about Dragon Ball, but it wouldn't be complete without the original Japanese credit break music, so let's play that, and then we'll get right into the Dragon Ball talk. So how did I get into Dragon Ball? Like I said, I used to catch just the tail end of Dragon Ball, and when I was a child, I remember watching what I'd seen of it and being like, humans fighting? Man, that's boring. Because I was so into Pokemon, and like the Pokemon had these magic abilities, and they were all interesting and colorful, and it just, I'd rather see those fight than like just humans, which is a weird bar to entry, but as you can imagine, like, I just used to keep catching the tail end of Dragon Ball, and evidently something would have grabbed my attention. Like, I think it was the fight between Goku and Vegeta, where Goku is like, he's fighting Vegeta and he keeps using that technique called the Kaioken, which it was very vague as to explain how it worked, but it would give him a huge boost in power, but it would like absolutely wreck his body. So I don't know if that meant his muscles and stuff were tearing, but he seemed to be in a lot of pain. Like, I know there's this one really famous scene where Vegeta flies up into the air and he decides that instead, like, he can't beat Goku in a hand-to-hand fight, so he's just going to destroy the planet. So he charges up this big purple beam and fires it down at the Earth, and then Goku fights back with his Kamehameha, and they're having this epic like beam struggle, and then Goku uses his Kaioken to get like just enough of a boost to completely overpower Vegeta and sends him flying into the air. So you can imagine me, who liked Pokemon, suddenly these boring karate humans are fighting with with magic powers. So I suspect that was probably what got me hooked. The mad thing is about that scene that the epicness of it was kind of lost on me at the time because I hadn't watched through Dragon Ball at all. So the thing with, there's talk about us getting weird adaptations released in weird order over here in New Zealand. So like they started us off with Dragon Ball Z, which is actually kind of like the middle of the whole series. Because by this point, Dragon Ball had been going for like 10 or 20 years. I'm not really sure how old it was when Dragon Ball Z started, but like the story actually starts when Goku was a child and he learns like how to fight and all this stuff. Like there's countless adventures, all these villains. Like it's a whole story, and it's just as long as Dragon Ball Z might be longer now because they keep making more of it, but it was a long story by the time Z came out. And so like the reason that this moment of the Kamehameha defeating Vegeta's Gallic Gun was so like lost on me at the time, but now I look back and I'm man, that's epic, is because so if you watched Dragon Ball, you would have seen Goku first learn the Kamehameha from his teacher, which is Master Roshi in English, and I think he's called Kame-Sennin in Japanese, which is like Turtle Sage. Hence my little title at the start about being the Turtle School Dropout, because that's the famous orange uniform that Goku wears is the Turtle School martial arts uniform. And the reason the Kamehameha is so genius is because like it's almost like a pun. I don't know. I'm kind of interested in linguistics. So like off the bat, you have Kame, which is turtle. Then the second two, Hame, is like doesn't really mean anything, but it rhymes with Kame. And then the Ha at the end, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, Ha and the kanji that it's used is like translates in Japanese to like ray or beam, that kind of thing. I could also be wrong, but I remember seeing a rumor ages ago that Kamehameha translates to turtle destruction ray, something along those lines. Plus, it's also phonetically the same sounds as the, what was he? I think he was a Hawaiian king, Kamehameha. And that was always a weird thing with the dub. The dub could never decide how they were going to say the name, because I guess if you're going for the original Japanese, the correct pronunciation would be Kamehameha. But because of the everyone kind of knowing King Kamehameha, that was how it was pronounced in a lot of dubs, so I don't think it was ever clear what the correct pronunciation was for it. But that move has got to be like the most iconic thing out of Dragon Ball Z. The way they clasp their hands together in front of them, bring it down behind them, they say all the syllables slowly while they're charging their power up, and then the final like ha as they're shooting the attack. Like if you're a young man around 30, maybe even a little bit younger, and you're trying to tell me that you've never tried to do the Kamehameha like in your backyard, you're fucking lying to me. Don't fucking lie to me. You're going to hell for lying. Or more accurately, you're going to HFIL, because we could talk for days about the changes that the dub made to make it a little more kid-friendly, like changing out references of beer and changing it to juice, and this is like you can literally go to hell in Dragon Ball if you die and you're a bad person. And the demons that are in hell, they walk around with these like white wife beater tracksuits on with the words hell written on them. But I guess in the dub they didn't want to have hell, so they changed the letters by erasing certain bits of it. So it says HFIL, which translates to something like home for infinite losers. And so anyway, the reason I think the Kamehameha is so that moment is so epic is because if you watch through Dragon Ball, you see him learn it for the first time, where he just shoots like a tiny little fireball out of his hand, and then he gradually gets stronger and stronger using it. It's more of a beam. And then by this point, if you've been following Goku for 20 years, seeing him use like a full power Kamehameha against Vegeta and overpower his beam and send him flying off into space, you're like, damn, that's the same move that he learned all those years ago and just shot like a little pathetic fireball out of his hands. And I think he destroyed a car with it or something back then. So yeah, I don't know. Now that I know the whole history of Dragon Ball, that moment is a lot more epic in my head because of all the backstory and Goku's whole journey of where he got to that point, all culminating in this massive epic beam struggle against an alien invader. I guess we'll begin to wrap up now as we're coming up in about 45 minutes. And I'll just try to talk about why I think Dragon Ball was so meaningful to me throughout the years. Like on top of course, it just being a cool show with martial arts and fighting, yelling and aliens and robots and like, what more could you really want as a small child growing up? But then looking back at it with sort of adult eyes, I do think about a lot of the lessons that were learnt through the characters of Dragon Ball. Like you could argue Goku is not a really, he's not a real good person. Like, and if you even follow it back from the Dragon Ball and you kind of know the history of like Goku's accent is essentially like a redneck accent. He lives up in the mountains as a little kid, and the way his accent was done is very like country bumpkin sort of vibes. And this is where I feel a little bit conflicted because the way they dubbed Goku, they changed a lot of his lines from like, it feels like they changed his character, and it feels like they wanted Goku to be Superman, if that makes sense. I'll give you an example of one of the moments, like after Goku defeats Vegeta in the on Earth in the first kind of arc of Dragon Ball Z. Vegeta's crawling back to his spaceship to try and escape, and Krillin walks up behind him. Krillin is the only character that has any kind of health left, I guess, of all the main characters down. Krillin barely manages to walk over. Krillin's got a sword ready, and he's going to kill Vegeta, but then Goku asks him to stop. And in the Japanese version, it's because Goku wants to fight Vegeta again, and I think there's a smidgen of like the idea being he wants to fight him again so that he can become stronger, because there's probably stronger people out there that Goku needs to be strong enough to defeat. But ultimately, the reason he asks Krillin not to kill him is because he wants to fight Vegeta again, because that's a whole thing of Goku's not a human, he's a race called a Saiyan, and their whole thing is they like to fight. That's it in a nutshell, but I'm not going to get bogged down in that. But I remember in the English one, they turned it to Goku asking him to like have mercy and, I can sense the good in him and all this kind of thing. And I don't know, it felt a little bit odd once I'd seen the original and then listening to what we had seen again. And like, don't get me wrong, I do like the element of Dragon Ball that show, the plucky underdogs standing up to a tyrant. For example, Frieza, who's like the second big boss character, he's this white alien thing. And there's a scene where Goku first changes into a Super Saiyan, which is a whole thing. I'm sure, even if you don't know Dragon Ball, I'm sure you know what a Super Saiyan is. And like, they had Goku do this speech where he's like, Frieza asks who he is or something. I'm pretty sure in Japanese, Goku literally just says something to the effect of like, I'm the Saiyan who was born on Earth, and now I'm here to defeat you. It was something along those lines. But in English, they gave him this big long speech where he's like, I'm the voice of all things in the universe, and I'm the one who says no when they just gave him this, like I said, they basically gave him a Superman speech, which is not really in fitting with the Goku character. Like, I don't know, like do what you want when you're dubbing it, but like, it just feels like they kind of went against what the original author had decided the character was going to be like. So this is the part where I feel conflicted, because I feel like Dragon Ball Z definitely put good morals into us as children, because it taught us like friends are important. You need to look out for your friends, and standing up for the right thing is important, and working hard and training to surpass your limits and all this kind of thing. Even though Goku is a terrible father, you do get the vibe that like family is important, and maybe in the more sense of like less this is your birth family and more this is the family you've chosen around you because of all the characters. They're kind of like a family especially by the end of Dragon Ball when you're going into Dragon Ball Z. So it's sort of undeniable that it definitely puts a lot of it tries to teach kids things like that. And then there was a whole thing where Goku's son was less of a fighter. He didn't have the same sort of killer instinct as his dad. And there was a whole arc where, Gohan just wanted peace, but it put the idea that, sometimes you have to fight if you want, how do I word this without it sounding weird, but, sometimes you have to fight, how does he word it? There's like just before Gohan changes into a Super Saiyan 2, there's this one of the robots, the androids, its head, it's so confusing if you haven't seen it, but the head of the android, this android gets destroyed by a big bad guy called Cell. He's this big green bug monster. The head gets thrown next to Gohan, and Gohan's sort of like paralyzed. He doesn't want to fight because he believes fighting is wrong. but then the android kind of explains to him that fighting is not wrong if you're fighting for peace. Something along those lines. So, that's quite a powerful message. Comes back to that whole idea that, like, the true evil is the indifference of good men, that kind of thing. And so, watching it back sort of as an adult, there are a lot of really, really good messages for children to take on in amongst all the fighting. And I like to hope these are some morals that I've taken from the show, like the importance of working hard, look out for your friends, stand up for what's right, these kind of things, which I think everyone can sort of agree they're pretty universally good morals to have. There's also an interesting case of, I guess this is more of an anime thing than specifically Dragon Ball Z, but there's the idea of enemies becoming friends in a time of need, like Vegeta. Well, even back further than Vegeta, Piccolo, who was a villain in the first Dragon Ball, he later on went to become like one of the best good guys on their team. Same with Vegeta, Majin Buu. I think even Frieza is like almost kind of like a good guy now. If you're watching Dragon Ball Super, which is the most recent version, which I guess that can be distilled down into the idea of don't judge somebody until you know them, or maybe more like people should be given the opportunity to redeem themselves for bad stuff they've done in the past. So yeah, that's basically. I thought I was going to talk more about what actually happened in Dragon Ball, but let's kind of leave it on that. Talk about some of the morals and some of the life lessons of all these characters that I used to spend so many hours as a small child watching when I'd gone home from school. The franchise is still going like incredibly strong to this day, even after the passing of Toriyama. I think they had a successor who was writing new chapters of the manga, so it's probably going to be one of those Marvel things where even in another 10 years we're still going to have new stories for the Dragon Ball characters. Admittedly, I've fallen off quite a bit. I did watch a little bit of Super. Dragon Ball Super is the current series that's airing. My favorite saga of that was the Goku Black saga. That was really, really well done. There was great sort of mystery, and it was quite scary at points. That was a fantastic arc, I thought. I also think it's weird. I've talked a whole heap about Goku, but I honestly think Vegeta is one of the most interesting characters in like anime, full stop, because he was literally a genocidal, planet-destroying monster when he first appeared, but he sort of reluctantly teams up with the good guys in the Ginyu Force saga, where they're fighting this kind of guerrilla battle over planet Namek, where they're trying to evade all of like Frieza's forces, and they're trying to pick them off one by one. It's a really, really good, that's really well done whole arc. Because that's the funny thing about Dragon Ball, is because Goku is so strong, they always have to, again, it's Superman again, they have to find ways to take Goku out of action so that all the like weaker characters can sort of fight the enemies and stuff. And this Namek arc was so good because you had Krillin and Gohan, they're basically little kids. He's an adult, but he's very small and weak. And they're sort of reluctantly teaming up with Vegeta, who's like, they kind of know is their only chance of beating some of these guys is to kind of team up with Vegeta, even though they know Vegeta is also planning to double cross them at some point. And there's a whole thing where, like, because Gohan is a Saiyan as well, Vegeta kind of wants to toughen him up a little bit and he, like, wants to sort of take him under his wing, but Gohan doesn't really like fighting, and so it's beautifully complex, and it's all the different characters have different motivations, and it's just fantastic. So then after that, he sort of reluctantly stays on Earth with them because his planet is gone, obviously, and then they even do a thing at the end of kind of Dragon Ball Z with Majin Buu, who's this big pink genie monster, and they do this whole arc where Vegeta sort of regresses. He decides that he thinks he might have been happier if he was evil again, because he's kind of softened on Earth. He's got a wife and a child, and he still hasn't been able to get any stronger. Well, he's gotten stronger, but he hasn't gotten strong enough to be able to defeat Goku. So he thinks maybe the only way he can do it is by agreeing to a sort of Faustian bargain and sort of selling his soul to the devil a little bit. He gets taken over by the bad guy with the promise that it'll make him strong enough to defeat Goku. Which, like, man, that's one of my soft spots. Is I'll do anything for power storyline and then realizing it was the wrong move and then having to sort of redeem themselves all over again. I love that. Impmon and Digimon, he had a great version of that storyline. Fantastic stuff. And then it seems like they've kind of... The problem with Vegeta is his arc sort of ended at the end of Dragon Ball Z, and now that it's like still going, it's like every arc they have to kind of reset Vegeta and put him back to like not strong enough to defeat Goku again, resentful of the fact that he can't beat Goku again, does something stupid or egomaniacal or whatever that makes things worse, and it like, I don't know. That's kind of the reason I haven't watched any more of Super, is because at this point they're delving into multiverse territory where there's like different universes. And I feel like these characters have like, they had such a good arc in Z that it feels like they have to put them in a little bit of status quo in order to keep making new storylines. I think it's cool. Like, I think the fights are still cool, and like I definitely do enjoy the bits and pieces that I have seen, but nothing is going to be as powerful to me as Vegeta's arc over the series of Dragon Ball Z. And I've always kind of identified with Vegeta as a character because Vegeta's character has been... He's not a... It's like... He is like a quote-unquote like elite level Saiyan, but I think that might have been more of a... what do you call it? Like it might have been more of a... What is the word? Like a nepotism kind of thing, like rather than based on any science. Because they always refer to Goku as being like a low-level Saiyan, whatever that means. And there's this interesting idea with Vegeta that like no matter how hard he works, he's never going to be as good of a fighter as Goku. And you know, if you watch the UFC and stuff, you might say, well, that's because Goku is about a foot taller. He's probably a lot heavier than Vegeta. He's got longer limbs. But I don't know, I've always identified with the character of Vegeta because like I genuinely feel like I have no natural talent for being funny as a comedian. Like even as a little child, I used to look at people that I saw as like funny, and I was like, man, how do they do that? They make it look so easy. And so like the whole idea of working very hard to just get to a kind of medium level of your chosen kind of field, you know, Vegeta's is fighting, mine is stand-up comedy. That's always hit home very hard with me, the idea of feeling like you're absolutely working your heart out and it's still not kind of enough, or you know, the FOMO of looking at those around you and thinking that they're just naturally talented, and it feels like everybody else is making progress when you're not. That idea is always really, really hit home with me. I think also the idea that now that I'm getting a little older, there's the idea of Vegeta putting his whole life into fighting, only to realize that like maybe there's more to life than just being good at what he wants to be good at. It definitely seems like in the later series they've made him be a little more accepting of being like a father and a husband and having friends and Earth actually being his home. And yeah, that's, like I said, I would have been pretty happy if Vegeta's arc had ended there. But what are you going to do? I'm not the author. Alrighty, well, that episode went about 20 minutes longer than I was expecting it to. There's just so much to cover. I could probably fill countless hours talking about anime in the 90s. So just for the end of the podcast, I wanted to say rest in peace to Akira Toriyama Sensei. Thank you for everything. Your work was an enormous influence on me, and it gave me so many hours of joy and entertainment, as well as plenty of life lessons to take with me into the future. I really appreciate the work that you've done, and I hope you can rest easy now. Otsukare-sama deshita. Alrighty, well, that's going to bring us to the end of the episode. I hope you've enjoyed the listen. I hope it was illuminating to you. Maybe you learn a little bit more about how my mind works from the way I processed some of these characters and storylines. I'm going to finish up editing this episode, and then I'm going to get back to watching another 90s throwback. I've been watching an anime called Gunbuster, which is, I'm on about episode 3 now. Started watching episode 1 and thought it was a kind of cool, like mecha, space, kind of sci-fi anime that had probably more fan service in it than I really need watching it in the living room. But there was a really cool bit in episode 2 where they did that interstellar thing where they like time traveled kind of, and then when they got back, even though they were only 12 seconds late, that turned into like 6 months on wherever they left, 6 months had passed by the time they got back. And so I was like, wow, that is really cool. So that has hooked me. So I guess I'm going to binge the rest of that, and maybe we'll do a future episode on Gunbuster. All right, well, you have a lovely week. Look after yourselves, and I'll talk to you again next Monday. Ruddler out. Thank you for listening to Ruddle Me This. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave me a review on your favorite podcast platform. You can find me on social media at Taylor Ruddle Comedy on all the major platforms. You can also join patreon.com/Taylor Ruddle Comedy for free, which gets you access to all sorts of extras and behind the scenes content, as well as allows you to communicate directly with me and let me know what you think of the show. Tune in again next Monday for another episode of Ruddle Me This, and until then, Ruddler out. Huh? You're still listening? Oh, look at you listening right to the end of the podcast. Just for that, I'll play you a little secret piece of, I don't know what this is. I made this the other day and I haven't really found a good place to put this in, so I'll just play it for you there. Hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much. I learned something kind of interesting lately. Did you know that Alexander the Great wasn't actually called Alexander the Great back in his time? Apparently he was looked at as more of a tyrant than anything else by the common people, and it wasn't until the Romans, hundreds of years later, that they actually started referring to him as Alexander the Great because of all the conquering that he'd done. And this got me thinking a little bit. Does this mean politicians from today's day and age that are very unpopular are going to be looked at as the Great in several hundred years? Like, to my New Zealand listeners out there, are we going to have Winnie the Great in 500 years? And that also makes me think, does that mean in his time, Alexander the Great sounded more like this?
I'm the greatest emperor in the history of Macedonia. I'm a self-made man, started with a small loan of 1 million soldiers and a kingdom from King Philip. We're going to make Macedonia great again.
Anyway, I guess we'll never know.
This has been a Tape Deck Media production. Thank you for listening.